December 17th, 2005, item number 113. Today's special guest is Larry Kudlow from CNBC's Kudlow Company podcast.
Podcast411.com. Listen different.
Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Rob, and this is the Podcast 411 podcast. Before we get into the interview with Larry, a couple quick news and notes, and of course, a tech tip. First up, as always, if you have any audio feedback you'd like to leave us, call 206-666-4357. That's 206-666-HELP. Or you can send audio feedback to podcast411@gmail.com. If you're looking for the show notes for today's podcast, they can be found at podcast411.com. Quite a few of you have been looking on how to do enhanced podcasting on the Windows side. And now there's a service from Mobasoft, that's mobasoft.com, that offers something similar to enhanced podcasting for both Windows and Macintosh platforms. It's not exactly enhanced podcasting, but it's very similar, and it actually has some added features that aren't available with enhanced podcasting. What it really is an enhanced Flash player. So maybe we should call this enhanced webcasting. I'm actually trying it out on today's podcast. If you go to podcast411.com and you look for the interview with Larry Kudlow, and you click on the interview, you'll see a player that'll open up, and it gives you the ability in this player where you can add in links, you can have some advertisements in there, you can have just pictures with links, you can have surveys, you can elicit feedback and comments right from inside the podcast while it's running on this player. Really cool service. Michael's done a great job. I'm testing it out, running this show as an example, and he's got one of my past shows as his demo on his site. But there is no relationship between me and Michael other than he happens to be here in the Kansas City area also. One of the other things you can do in there is you can even have links for PayPal donations right from inside the player as it's running. In my opinion, looking at a bunch of the different players that are out there, this one offers more options for the podcaster than any of the other ones out there. Matter of fact, I don't think anything even comes close. So go ahead and check it out at Mobasoft. That's mobasoft.com. And again, this is not a promo. This is not an advertisement. This is just news. Well, it's Saturday, so that means it's time for another tech tip from Michael. Here we go.
This is Michael Carino from DigitalMediaCastExperiment.com with another Podcast 411 tech tip. When purchasing a microphone, you'll want to know if it's going to run off of its own power or whether it's going to need power. Dynamic microphones actually generate their own electricity, and in fact they turn sound energy into electrical energy much the same way an alternator does, with the exception that the alternator coil spins around and a microphone coil goes back and forth. This alternating current is what shows up at your amplifier or recorder as a sound signal. The other microphones, the ones that usually need power, are condenser microphones. They don't generate electricity, rather allow electrical current to go past or not go past in relation to the sound pressure exerted on the microphone's capsule membrane. Albeit not much is needed, these microphones do need power to let through the gate. This is usually done in one of three ways. Consumer audio will often use a small voltage, somewhere around 5 volts, fed into the microphone circuit that will power the microphone. This is called plug-in power. More professional microphones will use a system called phantom power, which is power up to 48 volts sent up the line to the microphone. More professional computer sound devices, as well as many mixing boards and preamps, provide the option of applying phantom power to the line. Some microphones will use a battery to power the microphone. While making things simple for matching the microphone to the sound equipment, there is the issue of the battery going dead. This kind of power is very handy in some situations. Just make sure to have an extra battery in your pocket. So now you know. Go forth and buy yourself a mic. Thank you, Rob, for letting me talk to your audience.
Michael, as always, thank you for that tech tip. We're going to go ahead now and get into our interview with Larry Kudlow from Kudlow Company podcast and television show on CNBC. You can find out more about Kudlow Company at kudlowcnbc.com. That's KUDLOW CNBC.com. Without further ado, here we go. First off, let me say thank you, because if it wasn't for your show back in the days of Kudlow and Kramer, I wouldn't have gotten through my MBA at UConn.
Well, if that's even remotely true, it's a rare public service.
I listened and watched, I should say, every day. I mean, if I didn't catch you at 8, I caught you at 11 if I had class that night. So
Very funny. Well, great. I'm glad to hear it.
every one of my shows, I have a traditional first question, and I ask everyone this, and that is, what was your first computer?
It's funny. I think the answer is the IBM, was it the ThinkPad? It was a while ago. And, I mean, I'm a guy who's come to it late, although I've really gotten into it in recent years. But I think back in 96 or 97, something like that. I know it was made by IBM, and I'm pretty sure it was a ThinkPad. Okay. Does that sound right?
Yeah, that would be the right time frame for the ThinkPads were out, probably a little before that, even.
Yeah, and I hate to say it, but it kind of sat there lonely for a while. I got more and more into it, and now, of course, it's the center of my whole professional life. There's no question. It's absolute computer's the center. I've got a beautiful Sony Vaio here. In the office, I got a Dell, but at home, where I do most of my work, I've got a fabulous Sony Vaio, the 17-incher.
Those are very nice computers, yes.
It is just awesome. Absolutely awesome.
Okay, on the podcasting side, now that you're doing a podcast, have you checked out any other podcasts that are out there?
No, I pretty much go with Eric Greenberg's direction. He's introduced me, and we've done a whole bunch of these. And it seems to be working pretty well. We're getting a pretty good public response.
What I liked about your show was that it's not... A lot of people that are in the broadcasting world, like yourself, they've been doing podcasts, but really all they're doing is just rehashing material that they talked about or, just audio clips from the show, and they call it a podcast. Your podcast is actually unique, generated material for the podcast.
Oh, yeah. No, we try to do new stuff. In fact, we always do new stuff. And we have guests. Some of whom may have appeared on the program, but this has nothing to do with that appearance. This is new. We're breaking new ground for new information purposes, which is what we want to do. And we've had about a half a dozen of them, and we got a couple already scheduled, a couple of additional ones before the year ends. So, no, this is all new. I don't want to rehash at all, and I don't want to replay. That's not even interesting to me, much less listener.
Okay. Well, first off, thank you for doing it that way, because I think it shows a nice example of what can be done for mainstream media getting into podcasting.
Well, it's all of the piece. For me, it's interesting. It's stimulating. In other words, I get thoughts from these podcasting interviews, new thoughts, which may then trigger something for my program. But it's mostly about information gathering, isn't it? I mean, that's what the whole deal is.
Now, what is it that made you want to do a podcast, and what is it that you like about podcasting?
Well, first of all, I love to interview people. In addition to Kudlow Company, I do a lot of radio broadcasting, and I've been doing a lot on ABC radio, and I have learned to love to interview, and so this gives me another outlet, another avenue to develop content that can be distributed to viewers and listeners out there, and I just like doing it. I like the interaction. Whether it's a disagreement or what, I just like it. I'm a people person. I just love to mix it up.
I can understand that, because my show is all about interviewing people, and I've just come to love it. So, I mean, I've done 100-plus interviews in the last year, and it's been great.
What you find, if you throw out the right questions, you get a lot of interesting info and a lot of interesting opinions. And I'm interested in both information and opinions. And I want to hear what people are talking about. It's a way of staying connected. You got to get out, right? You got to get out and make sure you're touching all the bases.
Well, talking about questions, hopefully this is a good, interesting one, and that is that you're in the broadcast media, both television and radio. What are you hearing from your colleagues about podcasting? What is the general feel on this thing called podcasting from your peers?
Well, unfortunately, very little. I think that there's, at least in my line of work, business, stocks, and politics, not much at all. As far as I know, I'm about the only guy doing this stuff. I mean, when I talk to, TV broadcasters, and when I talk to radio broadcasters, as yet, I don't really hear podcasting. Now, some of my blogging friends, I run a blog site also, Kudlow's Money Politics, and I'm involved in Pajamas Media, Inc., which just put together a consortium of a couple of hundred blog sites. In fact, I just ran an economic blogorama. But they do some of that stuff. The bloggers do. But I don't hear it from the radio and TV people yet.
Yeah, I'm actually surprised that more radio and television hasn't gotten into it and hasn't embraced it. So it'll be interesting to see how 2006 plays out.
Well, I mean, I think the thought here is to try to get our exposure and visibility, but also our information and our opinions out to as many different kinds of people as we can through as many distribution channels as we can. To me, it's just another important distribution channel. So I would agree with you that I'm surprised that more TV and radio broadcasters don't go this route. But I have to believe it's in the early stages. We're not path breakers, but we're one of the earlier ones for sure.
Yeah, what I call it is we're just getting out of the point where we're moving from the lunatic fringe into the early adopter phase.
Well, I first heard about this from some of my blogging friends, so that's why when Eric Greenberg, my producer, when he talked about it, I picked right up on it.
Going forward, how often are you going to be releasing new shows? What's your schedule to release shows?
We're shooting for at least once a week. I think we've got about 6 of these things already done. We got a couple more on the books between now and year end. So as we develop momentum, I'm hoping to do at least once a week. I mean, look, it couldn't be easier, for heaven's sakes. It just couldn't be easier. And as I said, I enjoy the interviewing. So it's a labor of love. Look, it's like talking to you on the phone. We could have podcasted this. I mean, it's so easy.
Now, you said you haven't listened to any other podcasts right now.
No.
Are there some hobbies or interests that you have? I might be able to suggest some that you might want to listen to.
Well, you mean just apart from the
mainstream? Well, I think, if I remember right from your show, You're Catholic, there's a great show called The Catholic Insider with Father Roderick.
Oh, that's interesting. I wouldn't mind doing some Catholic podcasting. I also, well, that's important. That's a big part of my life. I'm a Catholic convert, as you may know, 8 years ago. So that's very important. You know, two other loves of my life are reading books and maybe podcasting different book reviews, reviews of books. I'm usually good for a couple of books a week. And the other thing I love is tennis. I'm an old prep school and college tennis player, and I still play a very strong competitive tennis game. Like one night on the Kudlow Company, we had Tracy Austin, the broadcaster, and it was, I guess, a preview of the U.S. Open. I love tennis. I'd like to podcast with my friend John McEnroe, who's a good pal of mine. That'd be cool.
That would be a great podcast. I would love to hear that.
Yeah, we play at the same club here in New York City, indoors, during the wintertime. In fact, one time, it's very funny, Jimmy Kramer and I used to do this pro football review every Friday afternoon. One time, we do it with Carl Banks, the ex-Giant linebacker, but I know one time we had Johnny Mack on because he was still doing his CNBC show, and he was so funny. I said, John, you're one of the greats in the history of the game of tennis, and he looks up at me and he says, well, you play a heck of a tennis game too. I just laughed. It's like I'm not even near his level, but it was because I know we played a lot of times side by side on the tennis court. He was looking at me. He says, hey, John, I can play.
Now, one of the questions I always like to ask is, what advice would you like to offer out to people so let's say your peers, about getting started podcasting? Well, there's a couple of pieces, the things that I think about. Number one, embrace the technology. Figure out it's not hard. And get your arms around that so you can get it off the ground. And number two,
do your homework. Do your homework so you're up to speed on the topics. And number 3, reach out for interesting people who are hopefully good copy.
Okay. Like yourself.
I mean, I like people that are not afraid to put an opinion on the table. I really I like that a lot.
Is there anything about your show you'd like to share with my listeners?
Well, the main thing is please watch us 5 to 6 p.m. Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, CNBC, Kudlow Company. That's the big one. And, the way we've structured this thing, and we're still a work in progress, we're still growing, but, we like to show the linkages, the relationships between business, the economy, the stock market, and Washington politics, and also international politics. They're all related. They're all related. And that's the kind of thing we like to do. Stocks, business, Washington, global.
Okay. Then I have to ask you this last question. Is the Fed ever going to stop raising the rates? Yeah,
well, that's a very good question. I have often asked that myself on the air. You know what? I think we got some pretty good news yesterday. The rewording of the Fed's policy statement really strongly inferred that we are coming to the end of the road. And my comment to that is, it's about time.
Amen.
Amen. Because I like it when the economy grows. I like growth. I like wealth. I like people working. And I like capitalism and prosperity. And I don't want to see these government agencies, whoever they are, stifle the best business instincts of men and women in business.
Well, Larry, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
All right, Rob. Thank you for having me.
Larry, thanks again so much for coming on the show. It really was a pleasure speaking with you. Everyone out there, please check out Larry's podcast. You can find it in iTunes by searching for Kudlow. That's Kudlow. Or you can go to KudlowCNBC.com. Coming up at the end of today's show, we're going to play a promo from Tim at the VAP. That's the Vintage Airstream podcast. And we also have some feedback from George at the Eclectic Mix podcast explaining how to talk about podcasting to your relatives, especially over this holiday season. Again, if you have audio feedback, please call 206-666-HELP or send an email to podcast411@gmail.com. And don't forget to visit our site at podcast411.com. Well, that's going to go ahead and do it for us today. As always, I'm your host, Rob, from Podcast 411, reminding you to listen different.
Getting ready to take that old RV out and take the family camping? Better make sure it's in good shape. That's just what we'll help you with here at the Vintage Airstream podcast. They've been called the Silver Bullet, the Toaster, the Silver Twinkie, all different names for the same trailers, Airstreams. Remember seeing those aluminum travel trailers running down the road, wishing you could own one? Maybe you bought a used one that has some problems and you need a hand, or you got in a little over your head. Don't worry, the Vintage Airstream podcast is here to help. The Vintage Airstream podcast talks all about Airstream trailers, restoration, repair, and travel. We answer your questions to help you with your vintage troubles, and we interview travel trailer related guests who always have an interesting story to tell. So if you have an RV, an Airstream, or thinking of getting one, this show will help give you the info you need in an entertaining way. Join us at thevap.com. That's THEVAP.com. So next time you're stuck in traffic, you can rest assured because you've tuned in to the VAP. The Vintage Airstream Podcast, internet radio for Airstreamers.
They built this trailer back in '63. You're looking natural in those green capris. Our restoration took a lot of parts. This little toaster is a work of art.
Hi, Rob. George Smith from the Eclectic Mix podcast. Concerning the situation where one was trying to explain a podcast, there are two routes I take when doing this. The direction depends on whether or not the person really wants to know. I've gotten pretty good at detecting the glaze in my girlfriend's eyes when an explanation of mine has gone on too long, so I apply that learning to this situation. About half the time, I can tell the person really doesn't want to hear more than a 5-second explanation, and mine is, it's a radio show that you can listen to whenever you want. I always have a few cards in my wallet, so I give them one, and I use those freebies from Vistaprint. The other case is when I feel that the person really does want an answer. Such a situation came up over Thanksgiving. Now, my parents know that I do a podcast, but I've never really tried to explain it to them. You see, they've got a $10 a month dial-up connection, so the last thing I want to do is frustrate them with a 40 meg download. However, we're at my sister's house for the dinner, and they have a high-speed connection. I went to one of the computers in the living room and changed the browser to eclecticmix.com. As we spoke, I ended up moving the conversation music, and then to the fact that where they lived, it was too bad that the West Virginia hills didn't allow for a wide variety of radio stations, then to podcasting. And it was all intentional. Set the subject up, pose a problem, then offer a solution. Now, I mentioned podcasting to my sister, who was sitting next to the computer, and she selected a random show from the website. We continued talking, and the show began. Now, my mother looked over at me and said, "I can't believe that that's your voice." She must have said that 2 or 3 more times over the course of the next 10 minutes. Since my sister had chosen a show that featured an indie group, I made sure that my parents understood that my other shows featured blues and jazz, and they didn't think that that was only one kind of music that was available. Now, the next day, I reinforced the whole idea by telling my mother that another possibility besides playing music would be to do something I don't believe anyone else is doing, which would be to read the Bible, perhaps a chapter a day. I could see the wheels turning, and I think she at least now has a pretty good idea of what a podcast is. So this is a situation where I had a captive audience and was able to manipulate things to facilitate my explanation. So perhaps over Christmas, some of your listeners can figure out similar ways to manipulate the scene where they can get a good explanation over to their families. So that's about it. Thanks for listening, and I'll continue to listen different.